Time is flying by, weeks are flying by. We're less than a week away from the NFL Combine, but for now, it is Thursday and we are still in the off season as we continue our positional reviews on the defense, staying with the secondary, moving over to the safeties. Welcome into another Strictly Stripes off-season podcast edition. Muhammad Ahmad and Mike Nizick with you on this Thursday night as Andrew Gillis gets a break until Friday when we round up all of our reviews with special teams. Later in the show, I'll be joined by ESPN Bengals reporter Ben Baby to talk about the secondary and other things we've talked about in this podcast involving free agency. But like we said, we're going to start with the safeties. And if you're starting with safety, there's really no other place to start than Jessie Bates. We've already discussed it on this podcast. We all agree, and Andrew agreed, that essentially his departure is almost inevitable at this point. He got the franchise tag last year. It's very unlikely the Bengals do it again because it'd be about $15 million, and I don't think the Bengals want to do that again after last year. So I think once free agency hits, he's going to walk, and he'll probably walk to a good amount of money no matter who signs him. But there's something I've seen in the last week that I've kind of wanted to wait to bring up until now, and that's ESPN insider Field Yates. When it comes to his bold offseason predictions, he thinks the Bengals keep Jessie Bates. He acknowledges it'll be hard, and it's going to be tough, but he thinks it's going to happen. In his words, basically crazier things have happened, which he's not wrong about. But Mike, is Field Yates out of his mind, or does he just know something that you and I are completely oblivious to when it comes to Jessie Bates?
Well, you're making bold predictions. I mean, obviously that's something that's not necessarily likely that could happen. I mean, I think did he not say, he didn't say it was a long-term deal. He just said to be back next year.
Right, that's what he said. I guess maybe he meant the franchise tag. Because
yeah, so I'd imagine that he meant that they do another franchise tag. I mean, obviously, Jessie Bates, held out fall camp last year. That franchise tag is not something that players obviously love to be under because, you're playing, you get a good amount of money for that 1 year, but no long-term deal. You put yourself at risk essentially for injury. It's tough. So I think that would be probably the scenario that could happen. I don't see them locking him up to a long-term deal, just given, where he's at age-wise and how much money they would have to invest. I suppose there's obviously a chance just if they, things fall into place and, they get discounts from other guys. But I also think since it's a bold prediction, that means it's something that's probably unlikely. That I just, I don't think that's the path that they pursue, especially since they drafted Dax Hill last year with the first-round pick.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's what we've talked about more in depth kind of whenever the season wrapped up a few weeks ago. But again, wish the best for Jessie Bates. I'm sure the Bengals feel the same way, but I think last year pretty much gave away that with Dax Hill coming, with the holdout, with the franchise tag. We've seen the final chapter of Jessie Bates' Bengals career. But I want to actually get to one of our subtexters who we've actually been getting some subtexters who have been engaging with us. And as I'm looking right here, one of our subtexters was saying that should Jessie Bates walk away, which again seems inevitable, the Bengals should pursue C.J. Gardner-Johnson, who played safety for the Philadelphia Eagles last year. That is very idealistic. First of all, we can't really say that for sure because the Eagles could put the franchise tag on him. Kind of like Bates, he's a Pro Bowl, All-Pro safety. Not All-Pro, but Pro Bowl safety. He helped the Eagles get to the Super Bowl. I just don't think that even if they don't put the franchise tag on him, which, again, we don't know for sure, but they could put it on him at any point. I think that's kind of unlikely. And, again, you've got Dax Hill, who we'll talk about later in the show. I just don't think the Bengals want to spend a lot of money at that position because, you've already got other big decisions to make with Logan Wilson, T. Higgins. Joe Burrow's going to get a Brinks truck worth of money, with how much he's going to get paid. So that is a interesting scenario there. But I think it was Shaquille Miller from North Carolina, Rutherfordton, North Carolina, saying if the Bengals can't afford to keep him, that he was down to sign C.J. Gardner-Johnson. Again, wishful thinking, but if the Bengals could do that, then they might as well keep Jessie Bates at that point. But when we look at the other free agent in the Bengals safety room, of course, that's also another big name, and that is Von Bell. His deal, that was a contract year. His deal was 3 years, and he had his final year on his deal. 77 tackles, 4 for loss, 4 quarterback hits, so kind of like he was in New Orleans. He played a little bit in the box, just not as much as he was in Cincinnati. Had some game-winning plays against the Dolphins and Patriots. Though there's two things I think that interest me with Bell. I mean, you can look at the big game-changing plays he had, like in those games I mentioned, but he's not quite that top 15 safety, like where Bates is, top 15 in tackles among safeties, interceptions among safeties. Von Bell's more of a statistically kind of down the middle safety. So does that kind of make the argument that the Bengals don't have to pay as much for Von Bell? Or how much easier do you think it is for the Bengals to retain him and the likelihood of keeping him at that point?
Well, he's older, so I mean the years are going to be less, and the dollar value will be less. Spot Track estimates kind of a 3-year, $30 million deal. That's $10 million a year, but could you front load that? So then, the last 2 years are, or last year, especially as a cuttable year, and, you don't have to pay much. The cap hit is much lower. They probably could afford a little more this year. But I think he's going to be just worth, overall money value a lot less than a Jesse Bates, because he's a veteran. And, when you find some place that you like to play, you find a defensive system you could thrive in, I think there's something to be said for trying to keep that going. I mean, he seems to really like Lou Anarumo and credit him for kind of allowing him to play the game that he did in college, and what New Orleans kind of didn't see in him. And so I think that Von Bell's, a more likely guy, to come back because of all that. It's just a lot less money overall when you're talking about the contract values between, Bates and Bell. Probably Bell's half the overall value. And you could probably organize, you can work that deal. If you can get a team-friendly deal where, you're not stuck with it in 3 years, just in case. So I think that allows you more flexibility with your overall cap situation. And just, Bates is you're not going to be able to do that on a 4-year deal with Bates, 5-year deal with Bates. It'd just be tougher to do. So I think that's why he's sort of looked at as the likelier guy, even though he's obviously, closer to 30, a little older. But yeah, I think that, he's kind of, you feel like he'd come back.
And, value from a market standpoint is subjective. It can fluctuate. It can change. But if we're looking at Spot Track, Von Bell is valued at just under $10 million a year, which makes sense because his base salary in his final contract year was, just over $6 million. If you include signing bonuses and workout bonuses, it's about $6.5 million. But I think at the same time, though, that's like you said, it's still less money than Bates. I mean, Bates would want 6-7 more million per year, and that's asking for a lot when you got other free agents who aren't even the names I mentioned, like, not free agents now, but soon to be, like Logan Wilson, T. Higgins in a year, and you're free agents right now in this moment in time. I think you can get a cheaper deal out of it. Maybe you can negotiate a little less, make it team friendly, like you said. And I think the important thing for the Bengals is, like we've already said, and I'll keep saying it, I mean, Bates is going to be gone. And I think if that's going to be the case, you have to have Von Bell, because we'll talk about Dax Hill in a minute, but, you're going to put Dax Hill in there. He mostly played as cornerback, like a slot corner when, Jalen Davis and Mike Hilton got hurt. Played a very teeny tiny amount of snaps at safety. I mean, probably less than 50 snaps. So, there's going to be some growth there. Like, we talked about Cam Taylor-Britt and, the ongoing learning lessons he had. It'll be a little different for Dax because he knows the pace of an NFL game, but, I mean, there's still going to be a lot he has to learn. Like, he's going to have to face a lot of safeties that he hasn't, I'm sorry, it's been a long day. He's going to have to face receivers at safety that he hasn't faced already. So, I mean, to have someone like Von Bell next to a second-year player like Dax Hill, I mean, do you think that makes it even more important to have someone like Von Bell at that point?
Well, yeah, I think that, you had two veterans that had played alongside each other, were really savvy, and helped kind of, I think, in the back end when you had Cam Taylor-Britt, some of that inexperience up front. I think next year it's going to be important to have that veteran voice as well. And then you're only really replacing one guy in that secondary, because if you project it out, Dax, Von, Mike Hilton at nickel, and then, Cam and Chidobe Awuzie, you've got a nice combination, I think, of veterans and those young guys you drafted last year. They can kind of learn and kind of mesh. Cam Taylor-Britt basically got, really almost a full season of experience in that time he played, even though he missed kind of fall camp and a month of practice. I mean, getting the playoff. I mean, I think he's ready. So he steps in a little more experience than Dax Hill did. Dax Hill played the most he played was actually at nickel in that Tampa Bay game. I was looking at PFF, and I think he only played 20 snaps at free safety. I think we'll free him up, and he talked about this the last day of the year, kind of clean out day, was knowing. He basically switched positions every week in that second half of the season, from backup corner to backup nickel, backup safety. And he said it was really hard, especially for a rookie. If they slot him in for Jesse Bates and he has a role and he can grow and learn, I think you'll be able to see a guy that gains more confidence, feels more comfortable. And so then if you pair him with Bell, I think that'll give him kind of a safety net as well.
And I think the thing that makes Bell so special, even if he's not a top 15, 20, safety when it comes to stats and numbers. I mean, you look at the impact he makes. You look at the veteran talent and experience, with two different teams, including, a team that was in the Super Bowl, just really over a year ago. That's going to be huge. And, we'll talk more about what Dax Hill's progression can and should look like. But you want to have someone like Von Bell because, if Von Bell's closer to 30, we don't know how much he has left in the tank, but you get what you can out of him, especially when, you want to groom and cultivate a guy like Dax Hill. I think that makes it even more important for the Bengals to keep him no matter what kind of deal they come upon. But stay with us because, like we mentioned earlier, ESPN Bengals reporter Ben Baby joins me. We break down the Bengals' needs in free agency in the secondary, both at cornerback and safety. We look at the bigger picture of what the Bengals need to accomplish in this offseason going into 2023 and much, much more right here on the Strictly Stripes podcast. Hey there, it's Muhammad Ahmad from the Strictly Stripes podcast. You might be wondering, what exactly is Cincinnati Football Insider? Well, it's a community of fans who want the inside scoop on the Bengals and a direct connection to the Strictly Stripes podcast and the reporters who cover the team, and that would be me, Andrew Gillis, and Mike Neislick. It works like this. Andrew, Mike, and I will text your phone a few times a day with breaking news, analysis, and our insights on the Bengals. It's the inside scoop on what we're hearing, and we'll give you the inside word before it even hits social media. Being an insider is the best way to participate with the podcast and get in on special events and Zoom calls with me, Mike, and Andrew. And the best part is you can text us directly. It's a great way to cut through the clutter of Facebook, Twitter, other social media, and avoid the trolls for just $4.99 a month. Still not sure? Well, just try it for 2 weeks, and if you don't like it, you can text the word STOP at any time, but you won't want to cancel once you join the community of hardcore Bengals fans. Here's the best way to get on board. Go to cleveland.com/Bengals, click on the blue banner at the top of the page, or if it's easier, text 513-940-4193. It's a great time to try the 2 weeks free, as we'll be reporting live from the NFL Combine in Indianapolis. Plus, we'll be covering free agency on the way to the NFL Draft in April. Give us a try for 2 weeks and see what you think. Just text this number again. It's 513-940-4193 and become an insider today. And welcome back into the Strictly Stripes podcast. Joining me is my special guest, ESPN Bengals reporter Ben Baby, who I was saying this to him just a few moments ago. Hard to believe I haven't seen him in almost a month since the season ended. Ben, how are you? How is the offseason? How have you been doing, my friend?
It's been great, Mohammed. It's been nice to kind of decompress a little bit after another long season. I guess we should start getting used to the Bengals going this deep. I'm trying to schedule some tea times, trying to catch up on some stuff around the house. This is what the offseason is for.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I mean, I can attest to that. I have enjoyed that myself, but there is still a lot to talk about, like you said, because I think it's fair to say we'll be getting used to this for a while. I mean, you were just at the Super Bowl last year. And then you and I were just at the AFC Championship, and who knows what's to come after. But, if the Bengals want to stay competitive or be even more competitive, I think this is going to shape up to be one of the most, if not the most, interesting off seasons, in recent history for this team. I think the first and foremost thing people will think about is, Joe Burrow and his contract extension and, what that looks like and how that plays out. But, I've talked with Andrew about this and Mike about this, but, other guys who are eligible for extensions, T. Higgins, Logan Wilson, is it possible to say the Bengals could ink Burrow and Wilson and Higgins to extensions this year, or do you think one of them's going to have to wait besides Burrow next year?
I think that's the biggest question about this franchise moving forward because, like you said, it's not just Joe Burrow in that 2020 draft class that the Bengals have to look at in terms of contract extensions. You got those top 3 picks that they had that year in Burrow, Higgins, and Logan Wilson. And I think that the market factors for all 3 of those guys, that's going to dictate what's going to happen for them moving forward. We all know that Burrow is going to command a lot of money. They have built the franchise around him. They've spent around him. That is what they've done really over the last couple of years. It would shock nobody if Burrow ends up being the highest paid quarterback in the league when you look at what he's done. I know that there's been a lot of chatter from the players about Burrow taking team-friendly deals and things of that nature. But realistically, even when you get up into the range that you're looking at, that's still going to be hard to keep everybody under the cap because the positions that we're really worried about, it's just one guy in particular, and that's really T. Higgins. Because when you look at the dynamics of the wide receiver position, that's what throws everything into flux for the Bengals. Because they have Jamar Chase, they will need to pay next year. And anybody who's seen what they have in Chase, they know that that's going to be a position that they're going to have to address. They know the relationship between Burrow and Chase. Chase has been to the Pro Bowl in his first 2 seasons. And that market is really, really high after last offseason. So can you afford to pay Chase, Higgins, and Burrow and field a competitive roster? That's the big question. And so we'll see, and we'll get a little bit of sense of how they feel that might go given what happens with Higgins.
So to me, it sounds like what you're saying, Ben, is, they're going to obviously prioritize Burrow, but beyond that, it comes down to Chase and Higgins, and then maybe, with respect to Logan Wilson, his extension, if that happens, would kind of have to come after all of those guys are said and done.
I think you could potentially – I think you would need to make a decision. You don't necessarily have to give an extension, but if you feel like you're going to make a decision basically on what you're going to do with T. Higgins and how much you think it's going to cost to sign Burrow and Chase, then you can see how much money you can allocate towards Logan Wilson's extension if you were to give one. And I think he's played really well. He's been battling injuries the last couple of years. I think that when you look at what he did in that Super Bowl game, heck, had the Bengals won that game, I thought he had an MVP-like performance given how well that defense played. And really, that was the reason Cincinnati almost won the Super Bowl. Mohammed, it's actually hilarious. Talking about the offseason, it's bad whenever I had a dream last night that the Bengals actually won the Super Bowl, but there was the winning player who caught the touchdown pass at the end was Michael Irvin. Don't ask me to explain it. My brain is totally in flux right now. But, in the reality version of that, it wouldn't have been the offense or Michael Irvin who would have gotten the Bengals the Super Bowl. I think the defense has played really well. And for me, we've seen the Bengals spend a lot of money on this defense because they've had their offense on rookie deals over the last few years. The question is going to be, how are they going to be able to, build that defense long term without the money that they've spent? Because that's been a big reason why that group has been so successful.
Well, Ben, I'm so glad you mentioned the defense because aside from Wilson, the question is, what do you do with Jermaine Pratt? What do you do with Jesse Bates, Von Bell? Those are your 3 biggest questions on defense. I mean, we've kind of talked about this on our podcast. It seems like Jesse Bates has given all the hints that he's done as a Cincinnati Bengal. There could be a chance with Pratt, although we think that it seems unlikely. Maybe you feel the same way, but someone like Von Bell, do you think that's a guy that they keep? Since we're talking about safeties earlier on this podcast with Mike Nizick, do you keep Von Bell? What does a deal like that kind of look like? And with Jesse Bates' seemingly unavoidable departure, how do you see kind of Dax Hill floating in there and kind of taking over? Which is why I think the Bengals drafted him for a situation like this.
Yeah, I think we saw whenever Jesse had his contract situation with the franchise, that Dax is going to be that safety whenever he comes back. I think giving him some reps there long term. I'm actually writing about this for ESPN.com in terms of the future of that secondary. Dax, we asked him and during locker room cleanout after the Bengals lost to Kansas City, and he said that it was almost a week to week basis as to where he felt like he was going to play, and it was hard for him to build confidence over the course of the season. And he never really was on the field all that much either. And so that's tough for a young player when you're not sure what you're doing. You're trying to figure out new positions, and then you're also only on the field for a limited number of snaps. It's hard to really build confidence. I think we feel that in any job. If you're only able to do it a limited amount of time, it's hard to really feel good that you're doing a good job. And I think that kind of applies to Dax. And so now with him getting the reins at that free safety position, I think that's going to be interesting. You see, Cam Taylor-Britt really played well. I've been critical of Cam over the time early on. I thought he kind of did struggle, and he admits he did as well. And then as the year went on, I thought he got better. I think the one thing I'd like to see from him is being able to track the ball a little bit better in the air and show those ball skills that the Bengals really loved when he was coming out of Nebraska. But, I think Vaughn, the price point for him should be a bit more manageable. He will be, I think, and having a veteran in that room for at least another season, having that mix with Chidobe Awuzie and Bell, and then potentially Mike Hilton and Cam and Dax, that's a good mix of young players, veterans, and a group that can grow. And ultimately, you want to hand the reins off from the veterans to Dax and Cam. And then don't forget Tyson Anderson. We'll see what he has and what he brings to the table as a potential box safety. He's someone who was on a redshirt year essentially last year. So I think when you look at that 2022 draft class, it was built in mind, like you said, gearing up to get ready for 2023.
And so with 2023, you also look at the fact that, in the secondary, you've got 3 quarterbacks who will be free agents: Jalen Davis, Eli Apple kind of headlining that, and Trey Flowers. I asked Andrew Gillis this yesterday. I want to kind of ask you, out of those 3, who do you see not staying and why?
I think without a doubt, it's got to be Eli Apple. And it's not a knock on Eli. I think that it just makes sense when you look at where he's at this point in his career. I think Eli has shown that he can be a starting quarterback. Given how polarizing he is, there's a lot of opinions about Eli. But I think that when you look at some of the other corners around the league and what Eli's done, I think Eli can be a starter for a team. And I think that if you're Eli and you look at the market elsewhere, it's one thing to take a 1-year contract and be a starter. It's another thing to take a 1-year contract and be a backup. And if he comes back to Cincinnati on a 1-year deal, you have to wonder, is he coming as a reserve or is he coming as a starter? When he came to Cincinnati, it wasn't with the expectation initially that he was going to start, because you have to remember they had Chidobe Awuzie, they signed in that same free agency class, and they also had Trey Waynes, who at the time was one of their most expensive signings really in franchise history. And so they weren't expecting the Waynes deal to bust as much as it did. And when that happened, then Eli Apple stepped in, and he's been a good starter for them. And so I think when you look at it, the market can, I would expect the market for them, Eli to, it'd be a win-win for both sides to essentially part ways. And we'll see what the Bengals have in Cam Taylor-Britt. And then Eli will have a chance to go make, potentially one of the last paydays of his career when you look at how old he is, when you look at how the lifespan of a corner is, especially in the modern NFL. I would imagine this is probably going to be his best chance to make a little bit more money while he's still in the league.
What about Trey Flowers? Because it seems like his market value, at least according to places like Spot Track, they kind of have him at the same range as Eli Apple. I think Flowers, with respect to him, not a knock on him, I think he played a little inconsistent. He got a little hot towards the end of the year. But do you think, again, I like to call this the Joe Burrow contract extension era. When you're in an era where all these signings are scrutinized in terms of where you spend and where you allocate resources, is it maybe a stretch to give that guy that much money for another deal?
Yeah, that's going to be, like you said, that when you're in the Joe Burrow contract era and that salary cap window is just a lot more shrunk, you have to be more judicious on what you can spend. And so I think that it depends on what the market will look like for Flowers. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of projections, but all of that can change the second that we get into the negotiating window here in a couple of weeks. We really see what the market's going to look like. And yes, we expect, I think internally, they expect the salary cap to increase like it has, with new television contracts hitting the books. So there will be more money. The numbers that we see on the cap now, that will eventually grow. But the percentages against the cap, that's what we really need to look at. Not the actual total values of the contract, but the actual percentages that each contract takes of the salary cap. I don't expect those allocations to change because the ratios will shift as the cap shifts as well. And when you look at Trey Flowers and what you would be spending on, you're essentially spending on a situational dime cornerback, because in a nickel sense, he would not be on the field. He's only on the field in dime packages or in specific heavy packages. And I think that that's something where you look at it and you go, is that worth the money? And for Trey, can he command more money somewhere else? So I think it's all going to come down to, just the economics of it once we get into free agency.
Money, 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 money. That's what it all comes down to. And just to kind of wrap up, Ben, because I really appreciate your time. I know you got to get going here soon, but just to kind of wrap up, as far as free agency goes, the NFL draft will be at the combine next week. So we're kind of getting more into the, these kinds of conversations with free agency being really just 3 weeks away. But, for the secondary, safeties and cornerbacks as a whole, how could you potentially see the Bengals maybe targeting those positions in free agency or the draft? Are there some names that stick out to you that the Bengals should entertain or think about, just depending on, what happens with Eli or Jalen or Trey or other free agents they have, like obviously Jesse Bates?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the draft and seeing what positions available. Do they end up going with a corner? Do they go tight end? Do they go offensive tackle? I think when we're going to be in Indy and in the prime of combine season, we're going to figure that out and see, kind of maybe get a sense of where the Bengals are leaning in terms of, what they feel like is the best approach for them in the draft. In terms of free agency, that's really hard to say. I think that when you're looking at it, depth is probably the biggest factor, because right now, you're going to need to bank on those rookies that you have drafted in 2022 and get most bang for your buck and see what you can get. Obviously Burrow's contract, if they structure it the right way, probably doesn't hit the cap really hard for another couple of years. That's what we've seen with Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes' contract. But that being said, you do have to be mindful. Maybe you do have money. If you have money, do you go out and splurge maybe on the offensive line, which they quite honestly didn't really do? The one player that they spent a lot of money on that offensive line, Alex Kappa, we saw how good he was. And so if you're the Bengals, you go, why not? If you feel like this is going to be your window, if they feel like they're going to keep T. Higgins, why not go spend, $11, $12 million on an offensive tackle, bring him in and say, you know what, let's get this line as good as we can look at it for 1 year, and then we'll address it moving forward. So I think that's going to be the question. How aggressive do the Bengals want to be? And really, how do they feel like these economics move forward?
I know I said that would be my last question, but since you bring up the offensive line, this reminded me, and I did want to ask, with La'el Collins, there's talk about, he's almost 30. He struggled with back issues. He rested during the week, at least every day during the week during the season. And he could be a big cap casualty. They could save about $6-7 million if they release him. Would you be shocked if the Bengals did that, or is that, something that wouldn't shock you if they end up releasing him to save money?
Yeah, I don't have any good internal feels on whether they're going to get rid of La'el Collins or not. And I'm pulling up his contract right now because, like you said, that is interesting. Our roster management system has the same thing y'all have, that his dead money goes down to $3.3 million. His cap saving goes up to $6 million. And you would really only be on the hook for one more year. If you're going to cut him this year as opposed to next year, not that big of a difference. The dead money, gets cut in half. But I think that it's going to be the fact that he suffered his injury so late in the year, and you look at the timetable, when can he feasibly be back? That's going to be the question, because essentially now you're paying an extra year for a guy who's not going to see the field. And so it would make more sense that if you are going to, cut somebody, maybe give one player 1 year, $6 million guaranteed, and just say, all right, you know what, we're just going to have you come in, see what we can get and move forward. That right tackle position, ever since I've been here, has been a complete revolving door. When you look at it, when I got here, it was Cordy Glenn and that whole saga. Then you had, Riley Reif. And now you have, La'el Collins. They just have not been able to find that stability. So, whether it be somebody in free agency or the draft, I think finding a long-term solution at right tackle is going to be paramount for this team.
Absolutely. Well said, Ben. Never enough time with you. But again, that is ESPN Bengals reporter Ben Baby. You can follow him at Twitter at Ben_baby. One of my favorite people on the beat, someone I've gotten to know really well, even off the field. So Ben, thank you so much for your time, and can't wait to see you soon in Indy.
Yeah, Muhammad, can't wait to link soon. Thanks for having me.
Likewise. Don't go away. We'll be right back on the Strictly Stripes podcast. And thanks for staying with us on the Strictly Stripes podcast. So, Mike, I was talking to Ben Baby, and he was kind of joking with me. I think one of the things he said was that he was very critical of Cam Taylor-Britt during the year. And, Andrew and I kind of talked about this, but I want to talk to you about it because, you followed Cam Taylor-Britt and wrote a lot about him this year. I guess what impressed you the most about his growth and maturity? Because, there's a lot of learning lessons he had, even in his first game against Cleveland where he had to come in for Chido Awuzie. Lou Anarumo told him don't do it again when he, blew a coverage pass on Donovan Peoples-Jones. What really stood out to you about Cam Taylor-Britt, and what does his ceiling look like going into his second year where he seems to be a surefire starter, no matter what happens with Eli Apple in free agency?
Well, I think his confidence level, just that he stepped into a situation, he went 2 weeks removed from being a scout team quarterback, replicating what Lamar Jackson brings to starting, and sort of never blinked. Made mistakes throughout the year, as a rookie would, and never sort of never sort of bowed down, never got discouraged. Really threw himself into like tackling in the run game, really physical. So when he'd make a mistake in the passing game, he'd usually get it back. And you saw the coaching staff, I think, really like not only his skill set, which is why they drafted him, but that attitude. And I think it earned him a lot of respect in the locker room. I think it allowed him to fit in with the veterans. And I think that stayed the course throughout the year. And so when you saw in the postseason when he was playing his best football, I mean, it was really something because, he had that confidence was there and he was playing to back it up. I don't think he was there yet early in the season just because how could you be? He sat out fall camp with that abdominal injury, missed a month of practice, but just really impressive makeup for a young player to sort of have that attitude, and not in a kind of a cocky way, but just sort of, believing in himself that he'd get it right. And he did. And the coaching staff, I think, really liked that about him. And, just impressive for somebody of his age with his experience to be able to ride that fine line and it paid off for him.
So on that same note, and that's very well said, and I think Andrew said something along those same lines, and I agree with all of that, but kind of flipping it back to Dax Hill, we talked a little bit about him and what it would be like if he had Von Bell by his side, assuming, Von Bell comes back in free agency. But to kind of zoom in more on Dax Hill, like you said, he mostly played the slot whenever Jalen Davis or Mike Hilton were hurt. To be exact, he played 44 snaps at safety. He actually started in a game against the Jets, but that was because of a package they ran. They put Bates in pretty much right after that first or second play, so he didn't really play much at safety. There are some moments that stood out, like if you look at that Saints game on that final play from Andy Dalton, where he heaves the ball in the end zone, him and Eli Apple break up that pass, and that was one of Dax Hill's few snaps, but he made it count. Again, I think that showed off a lot of the athleticism that got the Bengals to draft him in the first round last year. Again, the only concerns I have are, how is he going to respond to those, wide receivers who go deep? Like if, he's got to, play cover 2 or cover 8, he's got to go deep and cover a guy. I mean, what's that going to be like? What does the learning curve look like? And then, I think he struggled a little bit on special teams too. I don't know what the Bengals would do with him in that sense next year. Maybe they still use him on special teams, but he mostly played special teams, even when he wasn't playing on defense. And I think it was the playoff game against Baltimore. He had like 2 penalties on the kickoff returns because there was one game where he had 2 or 3 penalties. Is that right, Mike?
Yeah, I'm trying to look that up. He did. I think
trying to find that.
Or like at least 2, might have even been 3. Yeah, no, he had a lot of. He was penalized quite a bit on special teams, but it's it's a learning process. And I think there's going to be some growing pains early. Like Cam Taylor-Britt went through when he's a starter. And that I think that's to be expected. But like you said, there are positives to take from that first year. Just that when he was called upon and that sort of those limited actions, there were plays to be had. And so I think that's encouraging, and I think that's what he'll try to build on. And like I said, I think once he gets comfortable, you'll see that he had 2 penalties in the wild card round against Baltimore.
That's right. That's right.
And he had 4 overall on special teams. So not ideal.
Yeah.
But he might not be asked to do as much on there because, you want to lighten his plate a little bit to be ready for playing defense full time. But I think, they're going to throw a lot more on his plate but at one position. So I think he'll be able to get more comfortable with it. And I think that's the key for somebody like him where, he felt a little out of sorts at times with just how much they were throwing at him and things changing in the middle of the week he admitted it. It was not easy, and I think that's okay for a rookie to admit. I mean, he played his best. He didn't like shrink in the moment, but to say it just wasn't it wasn't an easy rookie year just because of the situation he was thrown into.
And I think, like you said, I mean, if Jesse Bates wasn't there this year, or like Jesse Bates leaves and next year is his first year, then yeah, like I would be concerned. But at the same time, like you said, you're going to make mistakes. It's a growing process. And I'm sure he's going to watch the film in the off season when he gets back into the stadium, whenever the Bengals get back into practicing in a few months. Like he'll remember those moments and he'll learn from them and he'll get better. And I think he will step up. How much of a drop off will there be? It's hard to say. But I mean, when you go from one of the top valued safeties in the league to a first round pick in the second year, there's going to be some drop off. But I think he'll catch up in a matter of time. But of course, that also means if you lose Jesse Bates, which again I think we will keep saying over and over again, like it hasn't officially happened, but it's pretty much going to happen. That leaves you with at least one opening from a depth standpoint at safety, because besides that, you have Tyson Anderson, who you could say like redshirted pretty much because he suffered it was an injury, I believe, in the preseason, and he just did not play for the rest of the year at that point. You had Brandon Wilson, who is a veteran who's been there for actually as long as Joe Mixon's been there, since 2017, but he hasn't pretty much played since he tore his ACL in the second half of the 2021 season because he got hurt again in the preseason, just like Anderson. So you didn't really have much depth there other than basically Michael Thomas, who is going to be 33 this year, was on a one-year deal, mostly played special teams, a very valuable voice in the locker room, was a team captain. They could bring him back. I think it's possible. I wouldn't be shocked if they don't. But, I mean, if he doesn't come back, then you have two openings. At the very least, you have one. You could have two at the safety position. And there's some names I think you could look at that are kind of interesting if you're really looking for some depth. And this is a name I've heard tossed around a lot, and I have mixed feelings about this, and that's Juan Thornhill, who played safety for the Kansas City Chiefs last year, won a Super Bowl with them. He's gone against the Bengals a good bit, so he knows a lot about them. He's about 27 years old. I mean, he'd be a cheap acquisition, I think. He only made about $1.1 million last year in his final year in Kansas City. Who knows if the Chiefs bring him back, but if they don't, I mean, he's there for the taking. Are there any other names that stick out from a free agency standpoint besides, Thornhill or, other guys that you think the Bengals should consider?
Yeah, I was kind of looking at when I did a mock draft the other day, not free agents, but with the draft in that second round, I think it was Sidney Brown, the Illinois safety, was up there, and he was kind of that. Yep. That was his spot. And it's like it crosses your mind that do you kind of try to address the depth that you would like another high pick there? Is that too much at safety? If you did that, you're kind of projecting to try to maybe plan for Von Bell's departure eventually. So it kind of makes sense that maybe they do that. Something like that instead of a veteran. But I think a veteran like a Thornhill would kind of fit the bill of what they're looking for. Somebody that could fill in if Dax Hill is struggling or if there's an injury. You probably want a guy with positional flexibility that could play both spots, just because you probably don't have enough money to invest, in two guys that are realistic options that could play. So I think the versatility will be kind of key in who they look at if they get a veteran. But I think it's possible they look at it and say we need to kind of plan for the future a little bit. Let's invest one more draft pick to try to pair Dax Hill up with somebody that would be very complementary in terms of their skill sets. So I think it'll be interesting to see what they do. I think Von Bell's price tag might help dictate what they are able to kind of afford there. But yeah, they need some help, obviously to round out the room. Same thing with corner, where I'm sure you guys talked about it last night, where they probably need somebody that could, play nickel and back up, be a backup corner. So they're mostly looking for depth sort of in the secondary, not looking for a top tier guy that breaks the bank, but somebody that they can get on a modest contract. And a rookie certainly fits that bill.
Yeah, and that's why I was thinking, like someone like a CJ Gardner-Johnson that's going to be a tough pickup because, he's going to probably get paid, whether it's by the franchise tag or another team picks him up. And so, I mean, you've got Thornhill. If you look at some of the other veterans who are kind of around that price tag, you got Deshaun Gibson, who's a lot older. I mean, he's been in the league for a while. He just played with San Francisco, was in Cleveland before that. You got Sean Chandler in Carolina, Carl Joseph. I mean, he's more of a strong safety, but again, if you're looking for just depth at that point, I mean, I think there's no shame in that. Yeah, there's some different options there. I think you could definitely look at those. And then, from a draft standpoint, you mentioned Sidney Brown. It's funny because his brother, Chase Brown, I think was one guy that turned heads at the Senior Bowl. That's a running back candidate the Bengals should keep their eyes on. And I'll talk more about that later as we get closer to the combine because we'll be there. But yeah, I think, you've also got like a Brandon Joseph from Notre Dame, a really good coverage player, Ronnie Hickman from Ohio State, someone that Jim Knowles, defensive coordinator, had a lot of high praise for, kind of played like a linebacker safety role. So think of like Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah with Cleveland. That'd be a guy like that. But I don't know if the Bengals want that since you kind of have Von Bell who fits that bill. Trey Dean, I mean, being an SEC guy, played for Florida, similar mold. There's some options there. And I mean, you could get one of them late too, because I think earlier in the draft, they're not going to focus on, safety. If they focus in the corner, in the secondary, it'd have to be at the cornerback position, but that's contingent on how free agency goes. But you got options. You got a lot of options there, like Jack Harlow said in one of my favorite songs. But yeah, we're going to have to see kind of how that plays out. And if Michael Thomas stays or goes, determines how much depth you need. But that's all the time we have for tonight. Stay with us because the gang will be back at it tomorrow as we round up all of our positional previews with special teams, a group that's having quite the transition right now, and we'll explain why. And plus, we get a little bit of a teaser / sneak peek into next week's Combine, mention some names, more names to watch, and what is going to be most interesting about the Combine. But once again, for myself and Mike and Isaac, I'm Muhammad Ahmad. Have a great Thursday night.